Hello everybody and welcome to another video tutorial. Now for this week's tutorial I am continuing the work that I began in last week's video. So I am trying to actually imitate a style from another artist. Now imitating another artist's style and adapting it to your own is something that can take some time, so it does normally require looking at a lot of reference, more so than personally I find looking at real life reference and reinterpreting that into your own style. So in this case I was working on quite a few subject materials that I don't normally work on, but this is a great exercise to help build up your skills because it forces you to observe how another artist interpreted certain shapes, forms, and how they actually rendered those pieces. Because when you start doing that, you actually start understanding why they chose to do certain lines, why they chose to do certain shadings, and all that does help improve your overall painting abilities. So in this instance, I chose something that was quite a bit different than what I normally work on at all. First of all, it's a female character. You don't see me painting too many female characters. I normally enjoy working on the male counterparts instead. But it's also the process involved for this drawing. This artist does tend to do more realistic images. The female figure, the emphasis is generally in the pose. It's how the woman is normally posed out in relation to her environment. It's very much a mystical feel for this character. So essentially it's the complete reverse of what I normally do, because I normally do really dark stuff. She does things that are very light and almost uplifting in style. So the artist I was basing my art on for this image was Mrs. Alphonse Mucha, and she's a very well-known artist. I actually have one of her calendars that I purchased a while back, and I purchased her calendar specifically for referencing different styles. So I do have a couple calendars that obviously have quite a bit of artwork in them, and I enjoy those books and those calendars because they have such a wide diversity of imagery. So it gave me a lot to work with visually as I was working on this. So what you saw me do in last week's video is I was working out traditionally how I was actually going to draw out the image. Now for this week it's more about the painting. So I already figured out the basic structure traditionally, and now it's more of deciding which software, if not just one software, would work best for the actual painting. So what I ended up doing for this image is I ended up reworking the line art, once again trying to reinforce the same style and elements that are indicative of that artist's works, and trying to incorporate that in my piece. Once I had the line work figured out, the proper structure of the face, the hair, basic rough details, and basic coloring, I actually next brought it into Illustrator. The first time I brought it into Illustrator, I wasn't happy with the results. A lot of that was due because I did not set up my pen pressure sensitivity for the brush, and that caused some issues. But I decided to go back to Photoshop, rework some of the structure, which is currently where I'm at this stage, and then I actually brought it back into Illustrator later on. So you will actually see me bring it in now, and essentially once I set up the proper pressure sensitivity, everything started working a lot easier. I started doing the harsh outlines that is very prominent in this artist's work. It's very interesting how she separates the character from the backgrounds, because she does use a very similar color palette. So she's not necessarily separating the character itself from the background elements via color. She's actually using the line art itself to separate the character from the background. So obviously I'm going to work mainly on the character elements first, because they are the most complicated. Because once you figure out the basic, or your focal point in this case, it's much easier to add detail information afterwards. But once again, I'm trying to make my own interpretation while observing her skill sets. So it's not going to be a full copy, it's not going to be me trying to mimic 100% her style. I'm trying to amalgamate both my style of drawing along with hers so that I can learn more from that initial style. So once I had that, then I went in and I started working out the details. Now I did use a different color of line because when I was looking at obviously my reference, I noticed that she actually ended up doing that in most of her images. Now sometimes she would tie in the colors. Now that's more difficult to do generally in Illustrator. So I just separated out the colors with the intention of going back in afterwards if necessary in Photoshop and modifying those. So once I had the basic structure and the basic details, I was then able to start experimenting on the folds and how I was going to go about rendering it. Now within my reference, I noticed that it does depend on the image that you're looking at, because the artist does actually have a fairly diverse method, although the basics are the same, in how she actually renders the folds. So sometimes she'll favor more the shadows and her line art will reflect that, and in other instances that's not necessarily the case. It's more the structure that's emphasized. So finding a good compromise between those two, and a compromise that worked well within Illustrator itself, was where the challenge was in this case. So I ended up essentially choosing what I wanted to focus on, and I wanted to focus on the folds, how those folds would move around the body, not necessarily shadows, because my full intention is to bring it back into Photoshop after I'm done all this and go in and paint in the details and fully render out the image, because that's what's the appeal of this artist, is that she has very harsh and very solid line work, but then she goes in and she softens out the painting and rendering for the face and different portions, and some of these details are so subtle you barely notice them. So that's what I've started doing in this case. Now what I did also is I exported the Illustrator file into a Photoshop file. When I did so though, I made sure to retain the paths in separate groups. So essentially by selecting the layers to be maintained, I was able to have those vectorized lines remain constant. The nice thing about that is, first of all, I don't have to worry about drawing vectorized lines in Photoshop, which makes it a lot easier because Illustrator is better suited for that. But I can also have them on a separate layer above all the colors and essentially paint behind them, and still have the ability to change the blending modes, which is actually what I ended up doing. Is I changed the blending modes to, I believe, a multiply layer. And then after I had that, then it was more of experimenting with the different type of colors I was going to use in this image. So obviously I have a lot of flexibility. I was actually using, for the majority of the actual character portion, when I was starting to rough out the colors and all that, I was actually using the soft default round brush for that. Once again, there's reasons for that. The characters that I was referencing from had very soft features to them, and I wanted to emphasize that. Now I switched between that and some texture brushes as well, but I made sure to keep the opacity very low so that as I was rendering it, it would still have a very soft appeal to it. Also for the nose area, when I was looking at my reference, I noticed that that's one of the few areas where the rendering is very soft and there's very little line art that's actually placed in that area, and that's to emphasize the softness of the face, and it gives the character a really nice appeal as a result. Now I did experiment with a bit of detailing in the clothes. I ended up not keeping that detailing because I did not like the results. I may eventually come back and maybe experiment a bit more with that, but in this case I decided not to keep the detailing. So I'm experimenting with some of the shading and decided I didn't like it, so I just removed it. For this image, I have actually several different layers, and the main reason why I have so many layers is because I need to be able to modify them easier. Because I am using paths, it makes more sense to have more layers, to have more flexibility in overall character and design. So right now I'm adding the eyes, and I'm trying to mimic the character very much that I was looking at, and I noticed that there's very specific portions and highlights that were being used in the eyes, and I made sure to transition those into my image as well. For the lips, there was very specific areas where the artist would soften up the edges, and I noticed it was mostly in the dark areas. You can barely tell what's there, but there is still some detailing. And it's very interesting to notice those very subtle differences, because once you start noticing that, you start thinking, oh, that would be a great technique to be able to add to other illustrations that I'm working on currently or in the future. So I'm just working on some of the details in the face, making sure to soften out those edges. I've just added some necklace elements in there. Very simple, because I was using essentially a texture brush that has a chain motif to it, so it creates the chains very easily. Working on the hair, and just keeping everything, all the detailing for the hair, very soft. I do want the original line work that I worked in Illustrator still show, but I also wanted to have the extra detailing that I noticed was in my reference. So the character is pretty much done at this point. So now it's more of trying to add an interesting element to the background so that the character stands out a bit more. So I darkened up the bottom of the character and lined it up to keep the top portion lighter so it stood out from the background. And also, once again, I'm using a lot of masks actually within groups to help isolate both the character and the background elements. And then it was a matter of simply using the marquee tool, both the circular and the rectangular one, to add some of those extra details, and then paint in simulation of extra detail elements in the background afterwards. So this image is nearly complete. This entire image actually took close to 8 hours to complete. I find that this image actually turned out really well, because you can definitely see that I have more of my style incorporated within this element as well. So getting both styles together to work in conjunction together was a very interesting challenge. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I hope to see you guys soon. So thank you and take care.